Okay, so this is a three-part revision session on plants. So if we just take a look at my lovely plant here, we can see that there are many different processes that we can look at when looking at plants that you looked at actually mostly in year 10. So down at the roots, we can look at the fact that water moves in by osmosis. And if we're looking at osmosis in plant roots, we can also then look at active transport. That takes us into mineral ions and then a little into protein. We can then also track the movement of water up the stem, looking at the vessels inside there. Taking us up to the leaf then, we can look at leaf structure and adaptations. We can look at the photosynthesis and transpiration. Then at the top of our plant, of course, we've got plant reproduction. Now this is part 1, so we'll be looking at roots, osmosis, transport in this section. Part 2 will include the leaf structure, photosynthesis and transpiration, and section 3 will include plant reproduction. So let's take a look at the root now. So if we look at our root, we know that water moves in by osmosis. But let's take a closer look at the structure of our root to understand how that water really moves through. So on the outside of our root, we will see that there are a number of specialised cells. Now these specialised cells are called root hair cells. Now if you take a look at these, you'll see that they're slightly elongated. Now this is really important because that elongation means that they have a large surface area. Now a large surface area in the root is really important because we want as much water to move in by osmosis as possible. And this elongated structure allows that to happen. Now, we've mentioned this word osmosis a couple of times now, so let's just remind ourselves what osmosis actually is. Hopefully you do already remember the definition, but if you don't, let's just take a look at that now. So osmosis is the diffusion of water from a dilute to a concentrated solution through a partially permeable membrane. It is really important in an exam that you do say it's through a partially permeable membrane. And saying it's a dilute and concentrated solution is a lot clearer than talking about low to high or high to low concentrations when it comes to solutes in water. So it's very easy to get your wording muddled. So do try to stick to this definition just to save any confusion. But let's think about what this actually looks like. What are these dilute and concentrated solutions? So if we take a little look at my diagram here, we'll see that on this side of my partially permeable membrane, I have a large number of what we call solutes. Now in this case, solute is anything dissolved in water. It could be here a salt, it could be any mineral ions, it could be in the body, glucose, anything that's dissolved in water is the solutes for osmosis. So we have a lot of solutes on this side and not many of our water particles. If we look on the other side of our partially permeable membrane though, we can see that there are only a couple of solutes and a large quantity of water molecules. So in this example, this here is our concentrated solution and this is our dilute solution. So the water is going to move from our dilute to our concentrated solution until an equilibrium is reached. And when an equilibrium is reached, we should have the same concentration on both sides. So that's osmosis. Now, what we need to consider now is how a plant makes sure that it has a concentrated solution inside the root so that water will move from the soil into the root. And the root is really quite clever about this. So what the root does is that it actively transports mineral ions into the root. So we have some mineral ions already in the soil, but what the plant does is it actively transports those mineral ions into the root to continually keep this high concentration inside the root so that we have osmosis taking place. But let's just remind ourselves now of what active transport is. Again, hopefully you do remember the definition, but if we don't, let's just take a look at this now. So, active transport is the movement of molecules from a low to a high concentration requiring energy. Now, you may have learned energy as ATP, and that's fine, you can use that. If you don't remember ATP, energy is fine in an exam as long as you say there's some form of energy having to be used to move things against the concentration gradient. Okay, so it's against the concentration gradient. So our mineral ions are pumped against the concentration gradient into our route, creating this high concentration inside the route of solutes, and so the water follows by osmosis. Now, if we're going to have a look at this active transport, we've mentioned the fact that these mineral ions become our solutes. So let's take this opportunity to actually think about what mineral ions you have learned about and need to know about. There are four main minerals you need to know. The first one, if you remember, is nitrate. Now, nitrate is used in a plant to make protein. You could also say, by the way, amino acids, because that's what protein is made of. Now, if a plant doesn't have enough nitrate, it will have stunted growth. That basically means it'll be really short. Obviously, protein is really important for building, and so if it doesn't have enough of that, it will be a very short, stunted plant. Our next one is magnesium. Magnesium is used to make chlorophyll. As you know, chlorophyll is the site of photosynthesis, so very important in plants. And if there isn't enough chlorophyll, chlorophyll is also the green pigment. It's a reason that leaves are green. The leaf of the plant will be yellow. Okay, next up is phosphorus. Phosphorus is used for making DNA. And if the plant doesn't have enough of it, it will have purple leaves. And lastly, we have potassium. Potassium is used in enzymes, particularly for respiration. And if we don't have this, again, we will have some yellow leaves. But to distinguish it from our magnesium, it will also have dead spots. Okay, so there are your mineral ions. These are the four main ones that you need to remember. More than likely, you'll only ever really be asked about one or two of them, but it is probably best to try and remember all four so that you can be able to identify any kind of deficiencies if they ask you in a plant. But as we've looked at nitrate, and that's taken us to making protein, let's just take another quick look at what protein is, because you did a unit on biomolecules, and protein is one of those molecules. So let's think about what protein is. Protein is actually a long chain. It's actually what we call a polymer. A polymer is a long chain of repeating units, okay? So the same thing repeated over and over makes a polymer. And in this case, our protein, as we've already said, is a polymer of amino acids. Now, the other thing that you might need to be able to say about protein is how you might test for it. And we test for protein, if you remember, using biuret solution. A biuret solution is blue, but if there's a protein present, there will be a colour change to purple, or you may say lilac. Okay, so that's our proteins. So that leaves us basically with then how do these mineral ions and this water move up through the plant to be used? Well, if you remember, inside that stem we have two types of main vessel which make up our vascular bundle. One of those vessels transports sugar. It actually transports sucrose, but you just need to remember it as sugar, that's absolutely fine. And the other one transports water and mineral ions, before I forget. Now, hopefully you remember that the one that transports water is known as the xylem, and the one that transports sugar is the phloem. Now, maybe we'll just take a little think about the structure of these, because you may be asked to refer to the structure. Now, when we think about the xylem, if we remember, is actually made of dead cells, whereas the phloem is actually living. The xylem was once made of living cells, but they died away. Essentially what that meant is what it's done is leave what we would call a continuous tube, like a straw, that the water can move up. In terms of our phloem, it's still made of living cells, but those cells just contain very few structures, very few organelles, so that sugar can move through it. Sugar, by the way, can move both up and down the plant, whereas water can in fact only move up the plant, okay, from the roots to the top, no other direction. All right, and that is our first section of our revision point. We've got the fact that the roots have specialised cells called root hair cells. They have a large surface area, which means we have a high rate of osmosis in the roots. Osmosis is the diffusion of water from a dilute to concentrated solution through a partially permeable membrane. In order to keep that concentration gradient, the plant actively transports mineral ions into the root. Active transport is the movement of molecules from a low to high concentration requiring energy. The mineral ions that are being pumped in are nitrate, magnesium, phosphorus and potassium. Nitrate needed for protein, magnesium needed for chlorophyll, phosphorus DNA and potassium enzymes. We've got the fact that a protein is a polymer made of amino acids, and we test for it using biuret solution, and we're looking for a blue to purple colour change. Water moves up the plant and mineral ions move up the plant in the xylem, which is made of dead cells. The sugar made in photosynthesis, which is converted to sucrose, moves up and down the plant in the phloem in a living vessel. And that concludes part 1 of the revision session. Thanks very much.